most people, when they talk about climate change, most people have their own ideas for, whether it's the government or is at fault, or whether it's fossil fuel companies and CEOs or rich people or all those kinds of things. But my scapegoat is Australopithecus. They were the ones several million years ago that gradually developed a shoulder anatomy that was an intermediary between the great apes and the modern humans. And over time, and this is over several million years, we gradually developed an ability to throw. And that ability allowed us to do things that, to my knowledge, no other species in the history of the planet has done. And that's separate ourselves from our prey or predators. I mean, we can kill, even, a million years ago, we could kill other animals without touching them, without claws, without teeth, without, there was no physical contact. And so that gradually allowed us to do some things that no other creature in the history of the planet has done. And over time, we perfected that so that we could be further and further removed from both prey and predators. And the result, the modern day result of that is now we can kill with, it's like a video game. We can use drones. We can, you see it on the news every day. We separate ourselves further and further and further away from our potential prey or predators or whoever it may be. And that was kind of the first step in the process. And I think of the steps in our history as waypoints. A lot of people talk about tipping points, and I think it's probably one of the most overused and abused terms that exist in the scientific world. In that, for example, if I drink enough coffee, my tipping point will be that I'll start sweating here before long. And people use tipping points to describe all kinds of different things, to the point that it really has become almost a meaningless term. Waypoints seem to be more descriptive of the critical junctures in our history that has brought us to where we are today. And I categorize there being 7 of them that I think are really significant. And the first one was the evolution of our shoulder with a downward scapular tilt that allowed us to throw. And that waypoint is actually, this evolution of our shoulders occurred over a several million year period. It wasn't like there was a point. It was a very long period of time. And so, and that's the other thing about where we are today. And a lot of the initial questions that Kim provided me are directly have to do with our history, and which is appropriate, because if you don't know where you've come from, you're certainly not going to know where you're going. And so the first waypoint was the evolution of our shoulders. The second waypoint was also was more recent, and occurred somewhere between 50,000 and 1 million years ago, and that was our ability to use fire. And if you look in a lot of the scientific papers by paleontologists and all of these people, they often debate, well, humans were using fire 600,000 years ago or 800,000 years ago or whatever the case may be. But the reality is it was a very long-term, chaotic, coincidental process, almost assuredly. I worked on a fire crew, I was mostly co-opted into a fire crew at different times early in my career when I worked for the Bureau of Land Management. And some of the coldest nights I ever spent outdoors were fighting fires. They would drop you out in a helicopter at sundown, and you'd build fire line and do all those kinds of things until early the next morning. But sometime during the night, the fires would die down, and all of a sudden, it's cold, seriously cold out, and the whole crew would pretty soon be sitting around a fire trying to stay warm rather than putting it out. And that's probably kind of the evolution of how we used fire. It was probably accidental at first that, just being a lightning strike happened and there was humanoids around and they, found out that it was warm and they could play around with it and, gradually learned that if you picked up a stick and walked a little ways away from the fire, you still had fire, and you could maybe learn to start another fire with that somewhere else. And so it was a long evolution of our mastery of fire, and there wasn't a date certain that people all of a sudden started using fire. And my guess is there were probably little groups of humans that had some clever person that, potentially learned how to use fire 500, 600,000 years ago. And there were other groups of humans that never learned how to use fire. But over time, that information was gradually disseminated over hundreds of thousands of years to more and more and more humans. And gradually that allowed us to become an invasive species. We were able to all of a sudden handle environments that prior to the use of fire, we'd never been able to use before. And that would include our historic range was Afro-Asia. And it wasn't until, I'm fairly certain that it wasn't until we were able to use fire that we were able to move into Europe and probably Australia as well. And at that point in time, we became an invasive species. And all of a sudden we were in habitats that for most of our existence, 5.9 million years, we had not ever been in. And the species that evolved in those habitats had never had any kind of an influence from humans or never seen humans before. And so there was a whole domino effect that resulted from our use of fire. So that was the second waypoint. The third waypoint was our ability to imagine things that don't exist. And there's still a lot of speculation in terms of how we got the ability to create myths. The first physical evidence of that is there's a lion man figurine from a cave in Germany that dates back, I think, 35 to 40,000 years, that certainly is, proves our ability to imagine things that don't exist. And it may even be, a precursor to the advent of religions. And so with myths, it allowed people to work together in larger groups without knowing each other. And it's no different than what we use. The entire modern civilization now is based on this. But just for an example, money is the most widely used one. And as long as I believe money is worth something, and somebody in Germany or Africa believes money is worth something, then we can work together and trade and do all kinds of things that we wouldn't be able to if we didn't have the shared myth. And the shared myths historically, like 30 to 40,000 years ago, were probably shared stories, but it allowed, instead of bands of, say, 10 to 20 to 25 people to work together, all of a sudden, 4 or 5 bands could work together, and that allowed them to hunt larger game or protect themselves from predators more easily, and just cooperate in much larger groups than they would have before. The speculation I've seen that seems to make the most sense is there may have been some kind of a gene mutation that allowed that to happen. But it's highly speculative. But I also think that it also began I think historically, humans were all introverts. Evolutionarily speaking, there would have been no advantages to being an extrovert, because the more you talked, the less you could hear predators or birds or other critters that were key to your being able to survive. And so people didn't talk very much because there was just it put you more at risk of dying, frankly. But when we started to coalesce into larger groups, with the advent of our ability to imagine things that didn't exist, then all of a sudden that gave rise to what I would think of as the modern day extrovert. So that was the third waypoint, and it was also a very significant one. The fourth waypoint was the advent of agriculture, and that occurred about 10 to 12,000 years ago. And, there's some speculation that we may have been doing agricultural stuff earlier than that. But in some places it was probably earlier, in some places later. It's kind of the same scenario as what I described with fire, where, people weren't all learning things. There was no internet back in those days, so they couldn't send emails back and forth. And so, but in a fairly short time, agricultural practices were happening across the planet in just about every continent. And the advent of agriculture, plus the ability to imagine things that didn't exist, gave rise to civilizations. And those, some of the earliest ones, and I'm sure most of you know, like Mesopotamia, and there are others that I think are just as that developed about the same time frame. But it also allowed class and the ability to dominate other animals. And it also changed the ecology. That's when we first really, we started changing the ecology with the loss of biodiversity from megafauna, but we didn't lose quite as much productivity with the loss of megafauna as all of a sudden we did with agriculture. Because all of a sudden we started pulling water out of places that, was naturally flowing and diverting it into other places. We had domestic livestock, and the way that domestic livestock use a landscape is much, much different than the way megafaunal animals use the landscape. And so you started getting soil loss, you started losing some of the nutrient exchange that was inherent with megafaunal animals roaming the landscape. And then you also started losing soils from agricultural practices themselves. And that it started out very, very slowly. But over time, that has gradually ramped up to a point that now the loss of topsoil, for a whole variety of reasons, is just one more threat to our biosphere. The fifth waypoint was the beginning of the industrialization period, and that was probably around 1800. And that's about the time that climate change started. And it allowed us to really begin to ramp up our population. It allowed us to go places that we hadn't been before easier. It allowed us to greater amounts of deforestation, desertification, and it really supercharged the loss of productivity on landscapes across the planet. And then what I consider kind of the last waypoint would be around 1950 with the advent of chemicals. And even though we were using chemicals much earlier than that, it wasn't the major industry that it had become then. And the other part of that equation was also the advent of plastics. And they're kind of one and the same, but they both are doing this same thing to our biosphere in that we're gradually poisoning ourselves with both of those, and we're doing it more and faster, and those things are accelerating. And so, but when you look, and going back to the title of my book, when you look at the time frames between the waypoints, our shoulder evolution happened between 2 and 4 million years ago. Our ability to use fire happened between 50,000 and a million years ago. Our ability to imagine things that didn't exist occurred between 20 and 60,000 years ago. Agriculture began between 8 and 12,000 years ago. Industrialization happened several hundred years ago, and plastics and chemicals 75 years ago. So the time frame between the waypoints gets closer and closer and closer together. And it's not that, but they are all affecting, they all all continue to precipitate an effect on our biosphere. And so that is why I decided on the title for my book, Racing to Extinction, because all of those things are cumulative and work together and amplify where we're at today